Welcome back. Get comfortable. Because tonight, we are not going to talk about a monster. We are going to talk about something far more unsettling than a monster. We are going to talk about a boy. A lonely, terrified, desperate boy who was handed the most powerful throne in the known world before he even knew who he was. And what happened to him afterward? History gave Nero one label and stuck with it. Madman. Tyrant. The emperor who fiddled while Rome burned. But here is the question that keeps me up at night. What if the madness wasn't something Nero was born with? What if the madness was something Rome and the woman who raised him built, piece by piece, with cold and deliberate precision? Let's go back to the beginning, because that is where the real story lives. The year is 37 AD. The city of Antium, on the coast of Italy, is drenched in late December cold. In a villa overlooking the grey Tyrrhenian Sea, a child is born into one of Rome's most dangerous families. His name is Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. The world will later call him Nero. His father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, is a man with a reputation that even Roman historians, who had seen everything, found remarkable. He was described as a man of ferocious cruelty and dishonesty, who had personally killed a freedman for refusing to drink enough wine at his table. When told his son had been born, he is reported to have told his friends with a shrug that any child born to him and Agrippina could only ever be a disaster for Rome and themselves. Even at the beginning, there was no tenderness, no celebration, just the cold forecast of catastrophe. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, was an entirely different kind of danger. She was beautiful, educated, politically ruthless, and possessed with an ambition so total and consuming that it functioned less like a personality trait and more like a second skeleton, holding everything else upright from within. She was the great-granddaughter of Augustus. She had already survived one emperor trying to kill her. She had watched her first husband die. She had been exiled to a barren island by her own brother, the Emperor Caligula, on suspicion of conspiracy. She had endured all of this, and she had kept her ambition perfectly intact through all of it, the way a diamond survives a fire. Not just intact, but harder. When Nero was 3 years old, his father died. Some said it was illness. Some suspected Agrippina had already begun to architect her destiny. Either way, Nero was now a fatherless boy in a world of daggers, and his mother held the most important one. We have to understand what kind of childhood Nero had, because without it, nothing that follows makes any sense. For a time, things were stripped down to almost nothing. Under Caligula's reign, with Agrippina in exile, young Nero was essentially abandoned to an aunt. He had no real home, no father, and a mother who existed only as a political ghost. Dangerous to know, impossible to reach. Then Caligula was assassinated. The new emperor, Claudius, was a stammering, limping, underestimated man whom the imperial court had spent decades treating as a joke. He was Agrippina's uncle, and she saw exactly what everyone else missed. Agrippina returned from exile. She positioned herself with extraordinary patience and cunning, into Claudius's orbit. She eliminated competitors, some through rumor, some through poison. She charmed him. She married him. She became empress. And Nero, now her most valuable asset, was brought back to the center of Roman power. But here is where the story becomes genuinely disturbing. Because Agrippina did not simply give her son a home. She gave him a project. He was her investment, her vehicle, her masterwork. He was the throne she could not sit on herself, wrapped in the body of a child. She arranged for Claudius to adopt Nero, making him the legal heir to the empire over Claudius's biological son, Britannicus. She carefully positioned her people around Nero, including the philosopher Seneca, whom she recalled from his own exile to become her son's tutor. A brilliant man, Seneca, patient, philosophical, gifted, in many ways the only adult in Nero's young life who genuinely tried to reach the boy underneath all the imperial machinery. But even that was Agrippina's calculation. A well-educated emperor reflected well on his mother. A civilized emperor would be easier to steer. Every gift Agrippina gave her son came with invisible strings attached. Nero, the boy, understood this somewhere deep and inarticulate. Children always understand more than they can say. He felt the love that was not quite love, the warmth that carried a cold undercurrent, the pride that was actually ownership. And so he grew up learning something that would shape every decision of his adult life. Power is not given, it is leveraged. People do not love you, they use you. And the only protection against being consumed is to consume first. He did not learn this from a book, he learned it from watching his mother's eyes. In 54 AD, Emperor Claudius died. The circumstances were suspicious, as most imperial deaths were. Ancient sources, with their love of a good poison narrative, pointed fingers at Agrippina. A mushroom, they said, laced at the table, gone before morning. Nero was 16 years old. He was brought before the Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite imperial bodyguard, without whose support no emperor could survive, and proclaimed Emperor of Rome. 16 years old, master of the Mediterranean world, and standing just behind him, close enough to whisper in his ear, was his mother. In the earliest months of Nero's reign, the arrangement was almost perfectly transparent. Coins were minted with both Nero and Agrippina's faces on them, both of them, on the same coin, as though there were two rulers. When foreign ambassadors came to speak with the emperor, Agrippina would appear and attempt to sit beside him as his equal. She controlled the correspondence. She controlled access. She had the names of men she wanted removed and men she wanted elevated ready before breakfast. She had waited her entire life for this. Nero, meanwhile, was discovering something surprising about himself. He actually liked being alive. He liked music. Desperately, passionately, with the kind of love that most Romans reserved for warfare and bread. He would play the lyre for hours, taking formal lessons with a dedication that shocked his tutors. He liked poetry, theatre, chariot racing, all of the things that Roman aristocratic culture quietly enjoyed but publicly dismissed as unbecoming of serious men. He liked people who made art. He liked the smell of oil and sawdust backstage in the theatres. He liked the noise of the circus crowd. He was, underneath everything, an artist forced to wear an emperor's clothes. Seneca and Burrus, his praetorian prefect, the two men who actually held the machinery of state together in those early years, gave him something Agrippina never intended. A relatively stable, well-managed empire that didn't demand his constant catastrophic intervention. The first 5 years of Nero's reign were later called the Quinquennium Neronis, Nero's 5 good years. Even his enemies admitted it. Taxes were reformed. Corrupt officials were prosecuted. The provinces were treated with something approaching fairness. Rome functioned, but underneath that surface, something was tightening. Because Agrippina was realizing, slowly and with growing fury, that her son was slipping free of the leash. The breaking point between Nero and his mother was on its surface a woman. Her name was Poppaea Sabina. She was married to one of Nero's friends. She was extraordinarily beautiful, politically intelligent, and possessed of a dry and cutting wit that could match Nero's own. She saw the emperor not as a throne to climb, but as a man to understand, and she was perhaps the first person in his adult life to do that. Nero was transfixed. But Agrippina was implacable. She threatened. She raged. She reportedly went so far as to offer herself to her own son, an act so extreme that even ancient sources seem uncomfortable recording it, in a desperate bid to maintain her psychological grip over him. What she had mistaken for a boy she could manage had become a man who resented her. The relationship between Nero and Agrippina in these years has the structure of a tragedy, not a political one, but an almost mythological one. She had made him. She had poured herself into him. And now the creature she had so carefully assembled was turning to face her. With her own eyes, he had learned from the best. In 59 AD, Nero arranged for the murder of his mother. The attempt that ancient sources describe first is almost too operatic to be real. He had a special boat constructed, one designed to collapse at sea and sink. He invited Agrippina to a reconciliatory dinner, embraced her warmly, gave her the boat as a gift to sail home. The boat collapsed on schedule. Agrippina, a strong swimmer, survived and made it to shore. When she sent word to her son that she had narrowly escaped a terrible accident, almost cheerfully, as though daring him, Nero reportedly went white with terror, because now, she knew, assassins were dispatched. They found her in her villa. She reportedly bared her stomach to them and said, according to one account, "Strike here. Strike the womb that bore him." She died on a beach. A woman who had survived an emperor's exile, a political lifetime of near death, and a rigged shipwreck, killed at last by the son she had built from scratch. Nero, when the news came back to him, did not weep. Or if he did, no one recorded it with any sympathy. What the historical record shows instead is a man who spent much of the rest of his life haunted. Suetonius records that Nero confessed to being visited by his mother's ghost in nightmares, that he called Persian magicians to attempt to summon and appease her spirit. but he could not bear being alone in the dark. He had killed the only person who had ever fully understood him, and the only person he had ever fully hated. These are not separate facts, they are the same fact. The year 64 AD. Rome, in the middle of July, in the middle of the night, a fire begins near the Circus Maximus. Possibly in a shop. Possibly, and this is the version that history most loves, set deliberately. What is not in dispute is what happens next. The fire burns for 9 days. 9 days. Of Rome's 14 administrative districts, 3 are completely destroyed. 7 more are severely damaged. Tens of thousands of people, some estimates run as high as 500,000, lose their homes, their possessions, their livelihoods. Rome, the eternal city, the center of the world, is reduced to an enormous field of ash and ruin. And the legend, the one that has followed Nero across 2,000 years, says that while his city burned, the emperor climbed to a high tower, put on his performance robes, picked up his lyre, and played music. He fiddled while Rome burned, a perfect image of imperial madness. Narcissism taken to its absolute extreme. A man so lost inside his own ego that he could watch 1 million people's lives turn to cinders and find it aesthetically interesting. But here is what the historical record actually says. Nero was not in Rome when the fire started. He was at his villa in Antium, the very city where he was born, roughly 30 miles away. When news of the fire reached him, he returned immediately. He organized relief efforts on a substantial scale. He opened his own palaces and grounds to house the homeless. He arranged emergency grain supplies and reduced their price to prevent starvation. He personally supervised the clearing of debris. The fiddling story, and the violin, it must be noted, would not be invented for another 1,500 years, almost certainly originated as political propaganda, spread by Nero's enemies both during and after his reign. So did he start the fire? The honest answer is, we don't know. What we know is that Nero used the ashes of Rome to build something he had dreamed of for years. He called it the Domus, or the Golden House. It was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most extraordinary buildings ever constructed. A palace complex that spread across somewhere between 100 and 300 acres of prime Roman land. Land that had been cleared by the fire. It included an artificial lake where the Colosseum would later be built. The ceilings of the dining rooms were fitted with rotating panels that could spray perfume and drop rose petals on the guests below. The entrance hall held a bronze statue of Nero himself, 120 feet tall, face turned toward the sun. At the dedication, Nero reportedly said, "Now at last I can begin to live like a human being." Read that sentence carefully. Now at last, after all of it, the throne at 16, the mother who controlled him, the assassination, the fire, the years of being simultaneously the most powerful and most constrained person in the world. What he wanted, most fundamentally, was just to live, to be, to create, to exist as something other than a political symbol. The Golden House was not evidence of madness. It was evidence of a man who had been denied himself for so long that when he finally reached for his own life, He reached with both hands and could not stop. The persecution of Christians following the Great Fire is one of the darkest marks on Nero's record, and it deserves to be looked at directly. Faced with a public desperate for someone to blame, Nero offered them a scapegoat. The Christians, a small misunderstood religious minority in Rome at the time, already regarded with suspicion for their refusal to worship the imperial gods, were accused of starting the fire. What followed was savage. Christians were arrested in large numbers. They were executed in the most deliberately theatrical ways Nero's court could devise. Some were wrapped in animal skins and torn apart by dogs in public arenas. Some were crucified. Some, most infamously, were covered in pitch and set alight in Nero's gardens at night, used as human torches to illuminate his outdoor dinner parties. The apostles Peter and Paul are both traditionally believed to have died in Rome during this period. There is no redemptive frame for this chapter. None should be offered. What we can say historically is that the persecution was relatively short-lived and primarily limited to Rome itself. It was driven as much by political calculation as by any genuine theological hostility. The Christians were convenient, vulnerable, easy to paint as foreign and strange. This is the logic of a frightened ruler, not a principled one. It does not excuse, it explains. And it tells us something important about where Nero was, psychologically, by this point in his reign. He was running. Seneca, his old tutor, the one adult who had genuinely tried to reach him, had been forced into retirement years earlier, as Nero's behavior became increasingly erratic and Seneca's moderating influence became a liability. In 65 AD, implicated in a conspiracy against the emperor, Seneca was ordered to take his own life. He did so, stoically, bleeding out in a bath, while reportedly dictating philosophical notes to his secretaries. To the end, Burrus, the loyal Praetorian prefect, had died 2 years earlier of throat cancer, or possibly poison. Nero had killed his mother. He would later execute his first wife Octavia, after having her falsely accused and exiled, and then beheaded. He kicked his beloved Poppaea to death while she was pregnant, in a fit of rage over something trivial, and then, devastated by her loss, reportedly attempted to find a boy who resembled her and had him raised as a woman. These are the actions of a man in psychological freefall, not a man born evil, a man who had been taught from the very beginning that love was a control mechanism, that power was the only honest relationship, and that anyone who mattered most could be taken away or used against you at any moment. He had internalized his mother so completely that after killing her, he continued to become her. By 68 AD, the empire had begun to fracture around him. Rebellions broke out in Gaul. Then in Spain, the Praetorian Guard, the one institution whose loyalty was absolutely essential to any emperor's survival, began to waver. Nero's response to crisis had always been the same. He performed. He threw elaborate festivals. He entered singing competitions, Greek-style contests that Roman aristocratic culture found humiliating for an emperor to participate in. Ancient sources, dripping with contempt, record that audiences were not permitted to leave during Nero's performances, even to give birth, and that guards were posted at the exits. Whether or not this is strictly true, it captures something psychologically accurate about Nero in his final years. He needed to be seen, not feared, not obeyed. Seen. He wanted to be loved, not as an emperor, but as an artist. As a person. The boy who'd been handed a throne before he could understand it, who'd been weaponized before he'd been known, who'd killed the only person who truly saw him, and spent the rest of his life haunted by that absence. He wanted someone to look at him and say, "You, not the emperor, you." The Senate eventually declared him a public enemy, a sentence of death to be carried out in the old manner, stripped naked, fixed in a fork of wood, beaten to death with rods. Nero fled Rome. He ended up hiding in a freedman's villa a few miles outside the city, in a shallow ditch behind some shrubs, listening to the sound of approaching horsemen. He attempted to stab himself, but could not bring himself to do it alone. He reportedly asked those around him to demonstrate how it was done. When the hoofbeats grew close enough, he finally drove a blade into his throat with the help of his secretary. He was 30 years old. His last words, according to Suetonius, were "Qualis artifex perio." What an artist. Dies with me. History buried him quickly. The Senate declared a damnatio memoriae, an official erasure of his memory. His statues were pulled down. His name was scratched from monuments. The Golden House was dismantled, stripped, filled in, and built over. The Colosseum would later be constructed on the site of his artificial lake, a deliberate act of public reclamation. The emperors who followed had every reason to paint him as irredeemably monstrous. It made their own ascensions feel cleaner. And so the monster story took hold. Grew elaborate. Grew mythological. In some Christian traditions, Nero became a prototype for the Antichrist himself. The number 666 in Revelation, sometimes interpreted as a numerical cipher for Nero Caesar in Hebrew. Whether or not that interpretation is correct, it tells you something about the scale of the darkness his name came to represent. But here is the thing that sits underneath all of that darkness, that all that mythologizing tends to obscure. The people of Rome, after his death, continued to place flowers on his tomb for years. Some of them, for a long time, refused to believe he was dead at all. Several impostors appeared in the following years, claiming to be Nero returned, and drew significant followings each time. This phenomenon, the return of a beloved ruler who secretly survived, is historically associated with genuine popular grief, not fear. The common people of Rome had loved him in a way that his own court never did. He had hosted enormous public banquets. He had subsidized grain. He had thrown open the city's spaces for celebration. He had been, in his own erratic and self-destructive way, a populist. He was not simply a tyrant to the people who lived in his streets and ate from his tables. He was their disaster, their spectacle, their strange, bright, burning thing. So what do we do with Nero? It would be easy and false to rehabilitate him into a tragic hero. The murders were real. The persecution was real. The cruelty was real. The bodies cannot be wished away by psychological analysis, but it would be equally false to leave him as the cartoon of pure evil that 2,000 years of political convenience have constructed. What Nero actually was, I think, is something more uncomfortably human than either version. He was a child raised inside a machine, a machine that needed him to be a symbol before he was a person, a weapon before he was a son, an emperor before he was capable of understanding what the word meant. He never had the chance to become himself outside of power. He never had a room of his own, metaphorically speaking. He never had a single relationship, not with his mother, not with his tutors, not with his wives, not with his court. That was not also a transaction. And when you deprive a human being of genuine connection, of being known and loved for what they actually are, rather than what they can provide, you do not get serenity. You get fury, or frenzy, or the particular spectacular kind of grief that looks, from the outside, like madness. His music was real. His poetry was real. The love he felt for Poppaea before he destroyed it was real. The fear he carried of his mother, even after he killed her, was real. None of that excuses the crimes, but it complicates the monster. And complication, I would argue, is more honest than simplicity, more useful, more human. Because the lesson of Nero is not simply, this is what a bad person looks like. The lesson of Nero is what happens when a society builds a machine, a system of absolute power with no checks, no genuine accountability, no structure that requires the man at the top to be answerable to anything except his own impulses, and then puts a damaged, frightened, brilliant, lonely person inside it and closes the door. What comes out the other side is not just a monster. What comes out is a mirror, 30 years old. Throat cut in a ditch outside the city he had once gilded in gold. What an artist dies with me. Whether he was right about the artist part is a question we are still arguing. Whether Rome died with something irreplaceable, something raw and strange and genuinely human that the careful, dynasty-minded emperors who followed him could never replicate. That is perhaps the more interesting question. He burns, still, in the way that all things burn when they are fed too much too fast, and given nothing to hold on to. And if you listen carefully, through all that smoke and mythology, and 2,000 years of carefully managed reputation, you can still hear something underneath. Not the lyre, not the crackle of flame, just a boy, wondering if anyone is going to love him for the right reasons. Thank you for listening tonight. If this story stayed with you, if Nero feels less like a cartoon and more like a question, that's exactly where I hope to leave you. Sleep well, and tomorrow, think about the machines we build and who we put inside them.